Okay, thank you all for joining us today. As many of you know, the SEC has been paying very close attention to cyber-related threats, and understandably so, as the financial services industry is a prime target. In 2022, the SEC introduced its proposed cybersecurity risk management rule and the proposed outsourcing rule to help safeguard the financial industry from cyber-related threats. And just last week, the SEC announced a trio of proposed rule changes that would impact all market entities, including changes to Regulation SP. They also reopened the comment period on the proposed cybersecurity risk management rule. These rules will require RAs to make significant changes to their compliance program. Today, experts from our team will walk through those proposed rules and their associated changes. Following the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, so please submit any questions that you have through our chat. On the line with us today, we have three folks from Fairview. I'm Frank Watson, founder and chairman of Fairview, and I'm honored to be with you today. Also with us is Amber Allen, our general counsel and executive vice president. She also serves as president of Fairview Cyber, which helps registered investment advisors develop and maintain cybersecurity programs.
Hi, happy to be here today.
Finally, from our compliance administration team is Jeremy McCamick. He is the director of policy management, and he is also a relationship manager for multiple Fairview clients.
Hello, everyone.
We're all happy to spend some time with you today. Prior to last week's announcements from the SEC, many of us expected the proposed rule to be finalized for cybersecurity to be finalized this spring. While the timing is still unclear, it is clear that the SEC is extremely focused on cybersecurity, and the current proposals will go far beyond current requirements. Today, we'll walk through those rules at a high level and go into more detail on some of the changes that will require the most time and the most attention for you. Before we dive into the proposed rules, it's helpful to first understand the current risk in our industry. Attacks against the financial sector increased 238% globally in the last 3 years, with some 80% of financial institutions reporting an increase in cyber attacks. These attacks are costly too. According to an annual IBM report on the cost of data breaches, the financial industry ranks second, only behind healthcare, for the highest cost industry for data breaches. And the average cost of a data breach in our industry is a whopping $6 million. As a result, regulators like the SEC have been forced to take action, requiring financial firms to have more secure environments to protect client data. I'll turn it over to Amber to give us an overview of current regulations in the advisor space. Amber?
Thanks for that great background, Frank. So currently there are limited regulations that govern cybersecurity for registered investment advisors. The Commission generally points to three things. The first is an advisor's fiduciary obligation. So as a fiduciary, advisors have to act in their client's best interest. And that includes protecting sensitive client information and taking steps to mitigate threats to cybersecurity and business continuity. The second major thing that the SEC will point to is Regulation SP, which, as we know, has been in the news some recently. Regulation SP was enacted in June of 2000, and the S in that stands for safeguards and the P stands for privacy. This regulation is what requires advisors to deliver privacy notices to clients and to implement safeguards to protect non-public personal information. And as Frank mentioned, the SEC recently released a trio of cyber proposals last week, and that includes an amendment or proposed amendment to Regulation SP. We could spend an entire webinar talking about the changes here, but just to give everyone on the line some quick context on the proposed changes, under the proposed amendment, advisors will have two material new obligations, one of which is already a best practice, and that would include adopting a written information security response plan that would help firms to respond to incidents. The second would be requiring breach notification to be provided to clients if their sensitive information is accessed. And under the proposal, advisors will be required to provide 30 days notice after becoming aware that their client information has or is likely likely to have been accessed. Regulation SID is the third of the major requirements that the SEC will point to in determining an advisor's cybersecurity obligations. And Regulation SID, or Reg SID, as we often refer to it as, was released by the SEC in 2013 to require advisors to adopt a red flag program to identify, detect, and respond to red flags in an effort to prevent and mitigate identity theft. So given the relatively limited requirements and regulations, the SEC has historically provided guidance and best practices through risk alerts, exam priorities, and enforcement actions. One interesting thing to note is that to date, the SEC hasn't released any no action letters in this space.
So while the SEC has had cybersecurity as an exam priority since 2014, these actions alone have not been enough to change the industry, but change is definitely coming.
It is.
Under the current leadership, the SEC is focused on modernizing regulations surrounding cybersecurity for advisors, public companies, and now broker-dealers. Here's a recent quote from the big guy himself. Gensler is pushing a ton of new regulations for advisors. Today, we're going to dig into some of those initiatives, primarily the proposed cybersecurity risk management rule and the outsourcing service provider rule. Let's take a deeper look into these proposed rules. Hang in there with us. Instead of us giving you a brief overview like most webinars, we're hoping that you will walk away today with a meaningful understanding of the new requirements and what you need to do to get ready. I'll now turn it over to our experts, Amber and Jeremy. Let's start with Amber.
Thanks, Frank. So on February 9th, 2022, the SEC proposed Rule 204-9 under the Advisors Act and Rule 38A2 under the Investment Company Act. Today, we will primarily refer to investment advisors, but just know that the requirements are very similar under each of these proposals. Under the proposal, advisors will be required to adopt and implement policies and procedures that are reasonably designed to address cybersecurity risks. And you might be thinking, well, isn't that already a current expectation? And that's true. But the cyber risk management proposal will significantly heighten expectations. And if adopted, all advisors will be required to adjust their existing cyber programs. For those that aren't already currently complying with industry best practices, it will be a really heavy lift. A second proposal was released in 2022 on October 26th, and under that, the SEC proposed a rule for outsourcing by investment advisors, and that's Rule 206-411. Under the proposal, and it's 232 pages long, it's very prescriptive, similar to the cybersecurity rule proposal. And under that, outsourced key service providers are required to undergo a review by investment advisors prior to that engagement. That's an important distinction, as a lot of investment advisors don't currently conduct a pre-engagement review. It's a best practice, but it's not always done. Jeremy, do you want to take us through the overview of the proposed cyber rule?
Sure. So you can see on this slide, the proposed rule is going to go well above and beyond the SEC's current cyber-related requirements. First, the cybersecurity risk management proposal includes an annual cyber risk assessment that would become a requirement, not just a best practice. Policies and procedures, you might already have something like this in place, but now it's going to be very specific and very prescriptive. So we're going to take a look at some of the key components of that later on today. Testing, so this includes annually documenting a cybersecurity review, such as data mapping, external, internal vulnerability scans, and access reviews on that annual basis. And then disclosures and reporting. This is the biggest change. So in their proposal, we have a change to ADV disclosures about your cyber risks and notification of breaches in a new form ADVC that would go to the regulator. Now, similar to what we saw with the marketing rule amendment, the cyber proposal would also amend Rule 204-2, the books and record keeping rule, as it pertains to some of these new requirements in testing and documenting. So we're going to review each of these elements, and keep in mind that these requirements are subject to change in the final rule, which we still expect sometime this year. While we can't make any guarantees, we would expect the majority of these requirements in the proposal will remain in the final rule. Now I'll turn it back to Amber to walk us through some of the specifics.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's great background. So it makes sense to start out with a risk assessment because, as we all know, all good policies will start with a good understanding of the risk. So there are a few things that firms should consider before starting their risk assessment. And the first thing to take into account is who's going to conduct the reviews. You need somebody with appropriate expertise. So consider if you have someone in-house, and if not, let us know if you need assistance. The second step is to determine the framework. There are various frameworks, including the NIST or ISO standards. Regardless of the framework that you decide to use, the proposal does make clear that there are a couple of considerations that advisors should include, and we'll take a look at those next. Third, the review needs to be in writing, and that's to document the review and evidence to regulators that you've completed it. The fourth step is, once the review is actually conducted, you need to identify areas with the biggest gaps and then prioritize those areas for improvement. And then this entire exercise should be used to adjust policies as needed. The rule also makes it clear that advisors are expected to review these cyber-related policies at least annually or more frequently if needed to reflect a change in business practice or risk. So let's take a closer look at what the risk assessment will include. It's going to vary by firm, but the ultimate goal of this exercise is to identify threats that could lead to significant breaches. At a minimum, the proposal would require firms to do two things. And the first is to categorize and prioritize cyber risks for all information systems used and data stored. The second is to identify service providers that have access to client information, including the type of information and the cybersecurity risks associated. The only way to accomplish the second prong is if you have a really thorough understanding of your vendor management program. So you won't be able to map out data risk of vendors if you don't centralize vendor management and know which vendors have access to what data. Vendor management is also addressed by the SEC's outsourced service provider rule, which we're covering a little bit later today, but this does emphasize the importance that the Commission places on vendor due diligence. A few other considerations that the SEC included in its proposal that advisors should also be sure to account for as part of their risk assessment exercise include remote work and traveling employees. So to satisfy this, you should be considering things like, do you have a VPN? Do your employees know to avoid public Wi-Fi when traveling? How are you managing your devices? Are they bring your own device or are they company owned and managed? You should also consider breach of a service provider as part of this assessment. And again, that's really important to understand who has access to what information. Also consider internal operations and insider threats. As part of this assessment, you would want to think about how employees are accessing information and how that might change if and when their responsibilities change. And that would include whether they're expanding their scope or reducing it. You would also want to think about your onboarding and offboarding process and make sure that there's a thorough review in place to review for access that's actually needed for the employee's role upon employment, and then to terminate that prior to the employee's departure. So once firms have completed the risk assessment, the information would then be used to create a custom tailored policy and procedure. The requirements under the proposal are really significant. So stick with us and we'll walk through some of the requirements. I would venture to say that most firms are going to need to make fairly significant updates to comply, especially if they aren't already in line with industry best practices. Jeremy, can you walk us through the policies under the proposal?
Sure. Thanks, Amber. So on this page, we've got some of the components that would now become required for policies and procedures under this proposed rule. On the left-hand side there, when it comes to security and access, you would need an acceptable use policy for those individuals that have access to client information or your advisory fund information. Next would be account authentication procedures. This is no longer a best practice. You would be required to include at least dual-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication if available. So that would need to be switched on for everything you're using. The third would be a password policy. So policies here would need to indicate how passwords are distributed, how they're going to be replaced over time, and when will they be revoked. You do need to have that timeline going so that they are refreshed on a regular basis. It can't be one password lasting out there for a really long time. And again, the passwords tie into that same authentication requirement in that second bullet. Next would be access management. So this should be limited based on a person's job responsibilities. And when we talk about access, it's not just digital, it's physical access, network access, and remote access. When you have this policy in place, when you have it tailored to your needs, you also need to include a review of this process so that it can be updated over time and tested. Next, we've got securing remote access technologies. Again, anything used to interface with your information needs to be considered here. So when employees are traveling or working remotely, that needs to be included. So a lot of activity on this during the pandemic. It's now becoming the norm in the hybrid work scenario. And so your policies need to reflect that and be up to date. On the right-hand side of the slide, we've got some of the components under information protection. So first is having data classification. Information should have a sensitivity level. And so noting the importance of that information to the advisor and its business operations. Next, we've got PIA tracking. So you need to be able to document where personally identifiable information, PII, is saved and how it's going to be protected. Where and how information is accessed, so stored, transmitted, including the monitoring of advisor information in transmission. So one term you hear about is encryption. It needs to be encrypted at rest and in motion when it's being transferred from place to place. On access controls and malware protection, I'm hopeful that a lot of this is already in place, so it may not be an addition there, but it is something that would be a requirement, would be formalized under this proposed rule. And last is incident response and business continuity. Again, a lot of this is already in place, but you do want to review yours to closely, see if any changes need to be made to account for new software, hardware, the remote work environment, et cetera. So you have to have a plan in place to ensure the firm can continue its business operations. And when you have a plan like this, you do want to conduct a tabletop exercise or other test of this plan at least annually to make sure it's still effective. On to the next slide. When it comes to threat and vulnerability management, what we're talking about here with detection, mitigation, and remediation, this is likely in place, but we want to make sure that you've disclosed your risks and substantial incidents. So we'll talk about the ADV in a second, but you need to accurately have a handle on this so that the ADV can tell exactly what you're doing. On vulnerability management, you need to be able to conduct an internal and external vulnerability scan with a process to track remediation and establish escalation procedures if you find a vulnerability, if something's going wrong. This also includes a review of vendor systems. So it's not just the information when it's on your side, but it's also during that handoff or back and forth with a vendor. Last in that column, industry and government threat source monitoring. We've got a lot of attention on this from the commission. And so you need to be able to react to commission alerts when they announce new threats and be able to adjust your program as needed. This isn't set it and forget it, but something that's going to have ongoing monitoring. You may need to hold custom training applicable to job roles that are impacted by this. All right, on the column on the right-hand side, for cybersecurity and incident response and recovery, yes, you've worked on BCP plans before, or maybe DRP, disaster recovery plans. The new acronym you're going to be seeing more of, or maybe have already seen, is incident response plans. So you've worked on continuity before, but are you ready for including that regulatory disclosure that's going to be required by this rule during a cyber event? And can you plan to meet these new requirements? Next, the protection of information systems, still a priority. Notification obligations, again, this is the big one. You will have internal cybersecurity incident information that you'll be obligated to share. So you have to document your response to these, the recovery process, and you will have to file the new ADVC to report significant cybersecurity incidents to the Commission very quickly, and we'll cover that in a little bit more detail. Overall, as you can see, this would require a lot of new policies for most firms. So it's important to ensure that policies are drafted by someone with specific cybersecurity knowledge, that the policies are tailored to your firm, its software, and its practices. Fairview Cyber can help with this. Just like any other policies firm adopt, the work doesn't stop there. You do have to conduct testing. So I'll pass it over to Amber to walk us through what that process will look like under the proposed rule.
Thanks, Jeremy. Under the proposed rule, a written annual report is required to conduct and evaluate the firm's cybersecurity policies and procedures. The report should be overseen by the person that's ultimately responsible for administering the advisor or the fund's cybersecurity policies and procedures, and should also consider any risk assessments that are performed. In terms of content, the firm should document an assessment of any material requirements under their policies and procedures, and there should be regular testing conducted to confirm that those material requirements were actually met, and as well as a resolution of any exceptions that are identified. A few attachments or backup documentation that firms would like to have on file would include internal and external vulnerability scans, a risk assessment, as well as tabletop exercises to evaluate business continuity plans or BCP and incident response plans or IRP. An incident log and a documentation of any responses, as well as a log of any material changes to the cyber policies and procedures, which is very similar to what we maintain currently for general compliance policies and procedures. All right, so similar to what we saw with the marketing rule, under Rule 204-2, which is the books and records rule, this rule will also be amended to reflect the new cybersecurity risk management rule. And it would essentially require advisors to maintain documentation of everything they're required to do under the proposed rule. That would include cyber policies and procedures, an annual cybersecurity review, the annual risk assessment, Form ADVC filings, if any, as well as documentation of any cyber incidents. Form ADC is an area of concern for a lot of advisors. It's received a lot of attention. So I'll turn it over to Jeremy now to provide a little bit more detail here.
All right, thanks, Amber. And so deep breath, everyone. This is maybe the biggest change. The change in Form ADV and the new Form ADVC are certainly going to affect investment advisors and prompt a lot of questions. As proposed, this would amend Form ADV Part 2A to require disclosure of cybersecurity risks and incidents to an advisor's clients and prospects. So under 2A, this would be a new item, item 20. And you would have to disclose material cyber risks. I think we're all comfortable working up risk disclosures for the 2A, the ADV brochure. But the real change is a description of any cyber incidents over the past 2 fiscal years. So if you have a cyber incident, as proposed, you'd be obligated to update the 2A and redeliver it, just like if you had a change to your disciplinary history under the current rules. And so, the 2A and client disclosure is a big job. Next, firms would be required to file Form ADVC within 48 hours of having a reasonable basis to conclude a significant cyber incident occurred or is occurring. So it begs the question, what is a significant cyber incident? That would be a cyber incident that significantly disrupts the advisor's ability to maintain critical operations, or one that leads to the unauthorized access or use of advisor information, where the unauthorized access or use of such information results in substantial harm to the advisor or substantial harm to the client or investor whose information has been accessed. Like other ADVs, Form ADVC would be required to be updated. And because this needs to happen while that significant cyber incident is occurring, you would need to update the regulator as you learn more. And so as that information becomes available, and hopefully as you close out that investigation, you resolve the issue, you would be updating your ADVC throughout to keep the SEC abreast of those changes. Similarly, on the investment company side, funds would also be required to provide prospective and current investors with cybersecurity related disclosures, including significant incidents that have occurred in the last 2 fiscal years and the funds registration statements. And the new requirement is also that they're tagged in a structured data language. The amendments, and I'm just going to read to the laundry list here, but all of these different forms are going to be changed to allow for this. So it would be amendments to Form N1A, Form N2, N3, N4, N6, N8, B2, and S6. So, as proposed, this would include virtually any way you have to register would have this allowance for an update on cyber incidents. The change to the ADV, not surprisingly, this got the most comments in the proposal. And it's a change that's going to need a lot of attention as you prepare for this new rule. Last week, the SEC reopened the comment period, and they said they did this to allow advisors more time to analyze the rule and prepare more comments. So I do think it's a great opportunity to share any difficulties that you're having as you prepare, the difficulties your providers or partners would face with implementing these new requirements. If you do have a comment that you want to share publicly with the SEC, do be sure to get it in by May 22nd. That's the new deadline of this public comment period. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Amber.
Thanks, Jeremy. Let's shift gears now and take a look at the outsourced service provider rule, Rule 206-4-11. So under this proposal, it's actually a lot broader, more broad than the name implies. It's essentially a vendor management rule, and it sets forth a framework that advisors would be required to implement for any covered function. Covered functions defined under the proposal, and it's a little bit ambiguous, but it would include any functions that are necessary to provide investment advisory services in compliance with the federal securities laws, and that if not performed or if performed negligently, would be reasonably likely to cause material negative impact on a client or the firm's ability to provide advisory services. There are exceptions for clerical, ministerial, utility, and general office functions or services. Under this proposal, advisors would be required to conduct a due diligence review before engaging a service provider. While that's a best practice currently, we can see that it's not always implemented consistently, and that it's potentially not implemented on quite as many service providers. So the scope's generally a little bit more narrow than what's included in the proposal. The proposal also includes some, again, prescriptive requirements on what the review should include, and that would entail reviewing the nature and scope of the covered function, as well as the potential risks resulting from the service provider performing that covered function and how to mitigate those risks. You would also be required to evaluate the service provider's competence, capacity, and resources to perform the services, as well as any material subcontracting arrangements related to the covered function. You would also be required, and this is a pretty big ask, to coordinate with a service provider for federal securities law compliance. I anticipate that this will be the most difficult requirement to meet, especially for any smaller service providers And that risk would also be increased if they're service providers that are servicing a lot of different industries and might not be as familiar with some of the requirements that investment advisors need to follow. Advisors would be required to conduct periodic monitoring and due diligence and to maintain documentation of those reviews as well. We would expect those requests or that information to be requested as part of SEC exams. Additional requirements would also apply to third-party record keepers. We won't get into the specific details, but just know that there would be a heightened expectation there as well. And similar to other recent proposals, the Books and Records Rule and Form ADV would also be amended to reflect some of these changes.
Well, that sounds like a lot of work. And what we want to do now is maybe just give you some tips on how to prepare for these upcoming rules. Jeremy, you want to help us with that?
Sure. Yeah. So how can you prepare? Start the process now. So you have your existing policies. We have a proposal as a guide for what needs to be changed. I think, for those of you that just went through the rollout of the new marketing rule, you have a pretty good sense of how hard it is to change current practices. Compliance is ready, but were the authors of marketing pieces ready? Were third-party providers ready? Similarly here, you need to have input from IT, your legal providers, on the process to disclose those cyber incidents, your vendors and providers on their risks, their policies for protecting your information. On the fund side, if you've established a liquidity risk management program under 22E4, you know that monitoring something on a regular basis has technical aspects that compliance can't create on its own. So it likely took partnership with trading or analytics, outside providers to develop that program and monitor those liquidity thresholds. So, it couldn't be done in a vacuum. And here we have a similar challenge. These requirements have very technical details, and compliance alone can't speak to them. So don't go it alone. There's still plenty of time. Assess what you need. Start reaching out to those partners as you prepare, and consider reaching out to Fairview Cyber for assistance. And now I'll turn it back to Amber to talk about that risk assessment.
Thanks, Jeremy. Great points. While these proposals are still in the rulemaking phase, it will require a lot of work. So we recommend that firms use this time to position themselves to comply so that when the final rule is released, they have somewhat of a head start, which will be really helpful, especially in this regulatory phase where we've got a lot of new proposals coming out all at once. There are a few focus areas that we would recommend looking at first. And again, please reach out if you need assistance. The first thing that I would recommend doing is making sure that you've got your annual cyber risk assessment completed. Just go ahead and get in that practice. And it would also provide a good opportunity to take stock of what you have in place and assess for any gaps. Conduct vendor due diligence and adopt a vendor management program if you don't already have one in place. That's something that we've seen requested on recent sweep exams. So I think it's time well spent, even while we're waiting on the proposal to be adopted. Access management is a huge topic and something that I would also recommend starting with. It tends to take a decent amount of time to adopt a thorough and accurate access management policy, and would also require looking at where data is stored, how it's accessed. So I would recommend starting there as well. If you don't already have a cyber incident response plan in place, that would be another great place to start. And then take a look at your business continuity and disaster recovery plans. Make sure that those are up to date, and if not, work on implementing those changes. If you don't already have cyber monitoring in place, I would recommend looking at vendors to help you with that if you don't have the capacity to do that in-house, and getting on some sort of a schedule to conduct regular vulnerability scans and patch management. Vendor management is also covered under both proposals, so this is a great place to start just as soon as possible. It's already a current SEC expectation, so it will certainly be time well spent. To implement this policy, you can start with identifying your key vendors, including contact information, the services that those vendors provide, and if there's a relationship manager or point person, both internally and externally, that'll be helpful to have. I recommend adopting a vendor management policy to govern your practices and to also centralize responsibility. It's a lot easier to manage a program if you have a point person or a point department to help oversee this. Otherwise, you have some inconsistent practices in rolling out the policy. And then lastly, don't forget to conduct due diligence initially prior to engagement of a new service provider and then periodically thereafter. It will help evaluate not only the contract, but also make sure that the firm's engaging vendors that are equipped and able to serve you well, and to do that before you're locked into an agreement with that vendor.
All right, great information, Amber. Thank you. We'll now open it up to some questions that have come in throughout our presentation. First question says the proposed rules that account authentication procedures must include 2 or more authentication methods. What should my firm do if a critical vendor does not provide MFA or 2FA?
Great question. In this scenario, unfortunately, the firm would need to look into considering another service provider. In this day and age, especially with the amount of breaches that we're seeing, you really need MFA, and it's an expectation at this point.
Great. Okay, next question is, will Form ADVC be public?
I can speak to that one. As proposed, no. ADVC, the C, you could stand it for confidential. But you are sending it to the commission. So you're sending it straight to the SEC. You've got that 48-hour period to get it out there. And then you have to update them as you go on and towards resolution of the incident. It's confidential, but the 2A, the new item 20, is not. That's public on your brochure. And so you got to think, as you're informing the regulator of this issue, you've got to make that decision of, okay, when does it become material enough that I would also need to update my 2A and get that change out there? So it does create a little pressure there. Also, we had the new proposals last week. Reg SP, as proposed, the new amendment also includes a data breach disclosure requirement. And so definitely moving in that direction of the commission wanting to know more and wanting more information out in public when these events occur.
Great, thanks, Jeremy.
Yep.
Next question. Can I just send a checklist to vendors like I've been doing for years?
So this might not be a popular answer, but unfortunately, no. The level of due diligence has just really increased. We've seen it slowly increase over the past few years, and currently it's just that approach isn't up to current expectations. You really need a more robust review, and also would need to actually evaluate what that vendor provides in response to your review and have some sort of an assessment and risk rating for that vendor. One thing to keep in mind that will hopefully help just at least ease the pain of doing all these vendor due diligence reviews is knowing that it will hopefully help the firm prevent data breaches. And in the event that a firm does have a data breach by a vendor, if you haven't conducted due diligence on that vendor, it wouldn't sit well with the SEC. So it is time well spent to evaluate that vendor at least annually.
Great. Okay, next question. I am a small firm. How can I be expected to implement all these new requirements?
Completely understand this question. So it is a lot, but unfortunately the requirements are the same for firms of all sizes. We've had several clients that went through a recent SEC sweep exam that focused on cybersecurity last year. And the sweep was pretty intimidating. The request list was long, and we saw clients, both large and small, receive the same request list.
Okay, great. This is a good question here. It's how do we prepare for these proposed rules, knowing that there are additional rules pending?
Another good question. Even though the proposed cybersecurity rule is out for an additional comment period, we're still confident that the majority of the rule will be adopted eventually. And given the amount of regulatory activity in this area, it's definitely an SEC priority. They have our attention. And so if you're a firm that isn't already complying with best practices, you're going to have a lot of work to do. We would recommend working ahead and adjusting your policies to get in line with industry best practices. For example, if you don't have an incident response plan, go ahead and get one in place just as soon as possible, so that if and when this final proposal is adopted as a rule, you'll be positioned to be in compliance before the deadline.
Great. Okay, last question here. And Jeremy, this one's for you because I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it warrants just going back through this again. Is that has there been any guidance or discussion as to what constitutes an incident and then what is considered significant? I think those are some key definitions that the SEC has put out there, and we all know that we have kind of minor cybersecurity data breach incidents every day in our firm. So right. Maybe go through that one more time just to give some clarity to those two kind of vague definitions that the SEC has put out.
Sure. And so, yeah, at this point, it is still just the proposal and the definition given. So I'll walk through the rule first. It's an incident that significantly disrupts the advisor's ability to maintain critical operations, or one that leads to unauthorized access to information, where that unauthorized access or use causes substantial harm to the advisor or to the client or investor whose information was accessed. I think the most obvious example here that would fit this definition would be a ransomware attack. That's one where you do have a significant disruption. Your operations are being held hostage, essentially. And that's the kind of thing that the commission pointed to as, they want to know if these attacks are happening to a firm. They want to learn about them quickly. So if they see it happening to multiple firms, they can come into action and offer some protection. I think, if you're really curious, you can take a look at some of the discussion in the proposal itself around that. But they are, asking for questions and putting out ideas as far as, what else could be added to that list. And so I think, for now, it's a real discussion. If you have some kind of disruption, are you going to be under disclosing or over disclosing? I'm interested to see what the final rule looks like and if they adjust any of the few scenarios they gave in the proposal.
Great, thanks. Okay, last question. This is an easy one. Will you share the presentation today? And the answer to that is yes. So we would be more than happy to send this out after the call. And then if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us. We'll have some contact information in there as well. And so for all of our clients that are on the phone today, we greatly value our partnership with you. I hope that you found this presentation to be helpful. We appreciate you joining and kind of bearing with us as we go through these kind of technical regulatory matters, but we want to make sure that we work with you to help get your firms ready for these new rules that are out there. So thanks so much, and you guys have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.